What's going on, everybody? C4, welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our little mini 2023 NFL draft series. We're going through all positions for the Philadelphia Eagles, and we're going to talk about some draft prospects in relation to their draft picks that could make great fits for the Philadelphia Eagles. And today, we're continuing on the defensive side of the ball. Yesterday, we broke down the defensive tackles. Today, we're going to look at the edge rushers, which is interesting for the Philadelphia Eagles because we're going to be kind of looking at two styles of edge rushers. One is your traditional 4-3 defensive end, and this ideally will be drafted to be like our Brandon Graham replacement, even though Brandon Graham is aged like a fine wine and is coming off a career year at 33, what is he, 33, 32, 33, 34, coming off a career of a torn Achilles. It's absurd, but it's fair to assume that much like Jason Kelce on the offensive side of the ball, we're probably on a year-to-year basis with Brandon Graham. So getting his replacement is going to be a priority for the Philadelphia Eagles. Generally, I do think at our defensive end spots, though, we have decent depth. You know, Brandon Graham and Josh Sweat are excellent starters. As much as it's appropriate in a certain way to rag on Derek Barnett, you could do a lot worse in terms of depth than Derek Barnett. You know, drafted as a first-round pick in 2017. I still think he's solid. Outside of that, though, we have Matt Leo. Just feels like he's been on the roster for 8 seasons and never played. Yasir Robinson, great athlete out of Florida State formerly, and Teron Jackson. But we definitely don't have that clear-cut successor for Brandon Graham in place right now. So we're going to talk about some more traditional defensive ends, but we also have this sub-pass rush linebacker type role, which has been occupied outstandingly by Hassan Riddick, who was arguably our best player on the defensive side of the ball during that playoff run. I don't even know if it's fair to say that it was arguable. He was dominant, unstoppable. Beyond that, though, we do have 2 other guys that can kind of play that role, Patrick Johnson and Kyron Johnson. And Kyron Johnson is a ridiculous athlete, very, very fast. One of the better athletes in last year's draft class at the linebacker spot. But I think it's also fair to say that while we have guys there, if Hassan Riddick went down, I don't necessarily know if we have a guy that can play that role. So we're going to talk about some linebackers that can kind of, while you may be able to pencil them in as a Brandon Graham successor, more so they're going to be utilized as our rotation and our depth behind Hassan Riddick. And that's where we're going to start. And we're going to start no further than, I don't know if I could say he's the best athlete in this year's draft class, but one of the best athletes in this year's draft class, and that is Nolan Smith, defensive end from Georgia. Now, as it relates to our defense, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I got 9 players we're going to go through. Obviously, we'll take a little bit more time at the top end of this that I think are going to come in, and if we did draft them, they would compete for that Hassan Riddick rule sooner than later. And that's Nolan Smith. That's 6'2", 238. He's a niche pass rusher, but just absurd testing. It is interesting he didn't test in the agility. You would figure you put up big numbers like this, he put big numbers in the agility, like the 3 code, and I'm assuming, though, it wasn't good. He wanted to just hide his weaknesses here just a little bit. I don't know. Either way, an incredibly explosive athlete, a former 5-star recruit. And at one point, I thought he was going to be a sleeper. I was like, man, this guy here. And there's one thing that I have noticed this year, a trend for me personally on these recruits, is like I'm all about the former 5-stars. These former 5-stars that are, you know, obviously scattered all throughout the draft because they've had varying levels of success at their college career and how they tested the combine. But I'm just finding more and more the guys that are like my guys, all at one point or another, were like high 4-star recruits that I'm just gambling on, that are going to be playing their best football at the next level. And I think that's going to be Nolan Smith because production has never been amazing at Georgia. He's 11.5 sacks during his career, but I think when you have an athlete of this potential, you want to take that stab that you're going to be able to develop him. And I think with someone like Sean Desai, I think a big reason why Sean Desai did get the job here in Philadelphia is how he is as a developer. Seems like a lot of players have played their best football under Sean Desai, a lot of good young football players. You know, you look at what they had on Seattle last year, Boy Mafe, somewhat similar of a role as like a hybrid pass rusher, maybe not big enough and long enough to play on the line, so you have him play a little bit of linebacker, and he looks like a hell of a player. So it's not all just like Tariq Woolen was what Sean Desai got credit for. There's a lot of young players on that Seahawks defense that seem to, you know, take to his coaching, and I think someone like Nolan Smith is definitely someone I want to keep an eye on here for the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, this is the high end. I think, personally, where his game's at, I would like him a lot more at 30 than 10. He's been a popular bot pick, though, for the Philadelphia Eagles at pick 10 if we stay there. I think that'd be a little bit of a reach because he's still a project. You're still drafting him for what he could be versus what he is right now, which I think right now he's just a great athlete. That probably is going to be an asset in the run game. I just doesn't have a fully flushed out pass rush arsenal, doesn't have a whole lot of counters, kind of wins how you'd think a guy that's built like this would win. A little bit short, not a lot of great length. Even though, his wingspan is plenty fine for a guy that's 6'2". I think he's an 81, almost 82-inch wingspan, which he can win there. But generally speaking, he's a guy that's just fast twitch and hopes to win with his athleticism right now. And that's fine, because those are the kind of guys that you can build off of and build them into an absolute superstar. And with his athletic background, I have no doubts about it. But I want to get those guys at 30. I don't want to get those guys close to a top 10 pick, because I've been very adamant for the Philadelphia Eagles. At pick 10, we need to get a game changer day one. And really, all these names, some of these guys are going to be more expensive than others. You're only going to see these guys or hear their name called if there's an injury. So I think that is something that needs to go into the idea of Philly drafting an edge rusher, be it like a stand-up sub linebacker edge or getting Brandon Graham's replacement, is that there's no real scenario barring injury that any of these guys start, and I feel a lot more comfortable getting those type of role players at pick 30 than I do pick 10. And it's unlikely Nolan Smith is going to be there at 30. But if he's there at 30, I'm running this one up to the draft board. He'd be a great fit for Philadelphia. Another great athlete that would fit that mold is Will McDonald out of Iowa State. 6'3", just under 240 pounds. Very good athlete as well. Elite production. Kind of the inverse of what we saw from Nolan Smith at Georgia. Will McDonald, 3 straight seasons, he was first team All-Big 12. 42 tackles for loss, 34 sacks, 10 forced fumbles. And then he tested very, very well. 4.7 at face value doesn't look ridiculous, but the explosion, the agility looks great. He's the kind of player that, also like Nolan Smith, you see 6'3", you're like, oh man, this guy doesn't got the length. He's got to be a little bit undersized, but 82-inch wingspan, plenty long enough. Sometimes you see these guys that are 6'3", 6'2", that have like 78 kind of T-Rex arms a little bit, and as someone myself, I don't have the longest wingspan, but I understand, it's tough to get off blocks. It's going to be just that much more of your physical build that's going to be working against you at the next level, where everybody is fucking gigantic, just monsters that can just engulf you, especially some of these offensive tackles like a Jordan Mailata. But Will McDonald, plenty length, phrasing, get your mind on the gutter. Great athlete, proven production. Now, he's going to be someone that we would consider second round, but it's in the same vein of yes, he'd be a nice little rotation. He'd probably be the first guy off the bench for Hassan Reddick, but how much do you want to prioritize depth for a guy that, it's insurance. How much do you want to have that insurance that if Hassan Reddick goes down, you can have a guy that has equal amount of juice and production that can contribute right away, which is what I think you could get with Will McDonald, maybe even more so than Nolan Smith. While his ceiling's not as high, but you want to burn a second-round pick on a depth guy, an insurance policy, and that same goes for another linebacker. We have Drew Sanders, who this guy here is a little bit of a tweener. I actually today just finished my linebacker rankings up on my Patreon. I'm finishing up the secondary right now. It's going to be out definitely before the draft, but I'm thinking probably Tuesday, Wednesday we'll have that drop. It's right up at the deadline there. But Drew Sanders is a tweener linebacker, can play off ball. Really, his role in college is kind of similar to what Micah Parsons did, where you can get him to rush the passer, he can go sideline to sideline, not a complete liability in coverage as well. He's just kind of, you got to figure out where he's going to play. He was recruited as a 5-star athlete, and in my scouting report, that sounds like my scouting report. I'm a guy on YouTube. From what I can tell, when you recruit these kids as athletes out of high school, it's on the college to figure out where can I put you in the best place to make plays. And I feel like the only knock against Drew Sanders is that he still is going to have that tag going to the NFL. He's a very interesting player where I think whatever team drafts him, he's got to figure out where do you want to utilize him. Do you want him to be a linebacker? Do you want him to be an edge rusher? Do you want to do a little bit of both? So that's kind of why I kind of put him in this mix of that Hassan Reddick type role. And I think he could be a very interesting pick for the Philadelphia Eagles. So I decided to include him, even though I think there's enough linebacker in him that when his range is probably going to be in the second round, early second round. Hyros is probably just going to ignore it because we don't value the linebacker spot. But he's someone that I do think is pretty interesting. Another guy is Yasir Abdullah. You want to talk about production. Now, this guy here is a hybrid. It's not a lot of crazy length, 6 feet tall, 237 pounds, but twitched up 4'7", almost a 37-inch vertical, and hasn't played and been a starter his whole career. He's one of those guys that just kind of came out of nowhere, but I'm glad he eventually did, because the production that he was able to put up in his last 2 years at Louisville, in 2021, 17 and a half tackles for loss, 10 sacks. Last year in 2022, 63 tackles, 14 and a half TFLs, 9.5 sacks, 4 forced fumbles, 6 PBUs, and he's a guy that I think is going to be more so in the range that I'd feel comfortable drafting Hassan Reddick type depth. Right now he's projected, Dave Brugler has him in the scout guide going in the 4th round, 4th, 5th round, somewhere in that range. And I'm all about it. Absolutely. Just twitched up. He's just a better version of Kyron Johnson, who we drafted last year out of Kansas State? Kansas? I think it was Kansas. He's a Jayhawk. But Yasir Abdullah just absolutely twitched up. I think he could definitely fill in that role as a tweener linebacker. Maybe the reason why I say this, and we also don't know because it was a knock against John Gannon, it's hopefully something we don't see a lot. But we had an issue last year where it just felt like they were dropping Hassan Reddick into coverage a little too much for a guy who we saw down the stretch is a very good borderline elite pass rusher. And I feel like if that's still a responsibility you want to have sometimes from that linebacker, you get a little bit more of that out of someone like Yasir Abdullah. So out of all the names I mentioned so far, even Nolan Smith, unless we're considering Nolan Smith at 30, if you say we have to get Nolan Smith at 10, or we don't get him at all, or we wait till the 4th round, 5th round, assuming Howie Roseman starts to acquire a lot more day 3 picks, Yasir Abdullah is probably my guy at this position for our backup rotational type role behind Hassan Reddick. Another player that we need to talk about is, a guy that's being considered right now as just a linebacker, off-ball linebacker. And that is Trenton Simpson. Potentially could go in the 1st round. I have a 2nd round grade on him. But the fact of the matter is that he's a ridiculous athlete, and he kind of was asked to do everything on Clemson's defense. So I feel like you're at this spot where you have a ridiculous athlete, where most people are projecting him as a sideline-to-sideline middle linebacker. You probably put him at will. But, most likely a Sam linebacker, which is kind of the role, I guess, if you're breaking down the depth chart for the Philadelphia Eagles. I think you can get him to rush the passer more than what we saw him really do at Clemson. In 2021, rush the passer a little bit more at Clemson, 12 TFLs, 6 sacks, versus last year we only had 2.5. A little bit. It's just the Clemson defense, man. It was a revolving door. Everybody on the Clemson defense looked better 2 years ago. Brian Brzee looked better. Miles Murphy looked better. Trenton Simpson looked better. And I think that he struggles a little bit diagnosing plays. I think he struggles a little bit, processing things in the middle of the field when everything's in front of him. I personally am on the side, like, he kind of gives off a little bit of Micah Parsons vibes in that he's such a ridiculous athlete. Just commit to utilizing him as a pass rusher. Sure, with his athletic ability, he's not a complete liability if you are classifying him as a sub rusher to drop back in coverage a little bit. He could handle that. But I think when all is said and done, he would be a guy that I would almost more so pencil in to the side of, because he's a tweener linebacker, but a guy that can go in and become a pass rusher for a team. I feel like that's kind of being talked about, but also not being talked about nearly enough as something that could be his career trajectory. So he's a guy that if you do value him and view him as a potential edge rusher, could be a sneaky pick for the Philadelphia Eagles at number 30. He's a guy I was kind of hoping we would see bring into a visit because, Sean Desai, and this is maybe too much, maybe it's lazy analysis when it comes to Sean Desai, but I think like a big reason why we need to feel confident as him coming in to be our brand new defensive coordinator is like we don't know for sure. He had like a little bit of a spell there as the defensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears, but I almost feel like what do we know about him so far? And it feels like he's a good developer. So if that's the case, and he's a guy that can take these raw athletes and mold them into scheme fits for his defense in the NFL, someone as raw and as athletic as Trenton Simpson could be a very intriguing fit for the Philadelphia Eagles. So definitely one to mention and monitor depending on, how some teams view him as a potential NFL prospect. But I think him kind of developing into a pass rusher, he could be the poor man's Nolan Smith in this year's draft class at pick 30. We got another couple linebackers, hybrids, if you will. We have Nick Herbig here from Wisconsin. He's a guy that had a lot of production at Wisconsin. I think he's kind of underrated right now. Maybe not the best athlete in a class where everyone wants, these 4.5, 4.4 type linebackers. But he's a guy that he's a very good football player. He's not a brutal athlete by any means. Let's actually switch his Raz up here because he's an edge. But let's move him to linebacker. It gives him a little bit better of a score. But, back-to-back seasons, double-digit tackles for loss. Last season, 15.5 tackles for loss, 11 sacks. And he's just, hey, his brother played for Philadelphia, very underrated for Philadelphia, Nate Herbig. And I think he's the kind of guy he's going to be a nice sub-pass rusher. I don't think he's going to cost a super high draft pick. I'm thinking he's probably going to go around the 4th round right now. So he's kind of in that mold of I think I would prefer an athlete like Yasir Abdullah. But that's the round that I really do feel comfortable adding some depth behind Hassan Reddick. I think Herbig could fill that role. Another big-time athlete that is also in that is Byron Young. 6'2", 250. Has some good back-to-back seasons of SEC production at Tennessee. 4-4, dominated at the combine. And I think he's one of those interesting ones where he could go higher than a lot of people are projecting right now just because of the background, the pedigree, and the athletic display that he was able to put on. But he still is a little bit one-dimensional in terms of, like, he just goes. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're going to be depth behind Hassan Reddick. There is nothing wrong with just being like it's a sprint. It's a sprint to the quarterback. Use your God-given ability to get there. But there's a level of, where's his ceiling going to be? Is he just going to be an athletic rotational pass rusher? And if that's the case, there's nothing wrong with that. But where's the price going to be for you to draft him? Right now, he's projected potentially go as high as the third round. I think he's a little bit raw for that. But also, it's fair to say that maybe there's still some more untapped potential for him as a pass rusher. But right now, as like a one-dimensional kind of speed rusher, I'd like to get that maybe day 3, early day 3 potentially. And the price could be a little expensive here for Byron Young. But I did decide just to showcase him a little bit. We have Isaiah Land. This is a guy who, when you break down his production, this is small school, right? Florida A&M. He was one of those guys that I was very surprised didn't transfer. I think he had a couple opportunities to transfer, and he decided just to stay and dominate at Florida. But obviously, a lot of times like that, when you just assume some guy can transfer, it's grades. You get to have good grades and stuff like that. But his production in 2021, okay, so you look at great athlete, undersized, 236. He'd be that sub linebacker. But in 2021, 43 tackles, 25 and a half tackles for loss, 19 sacks. One season. He put up players that go in the first round's whole career in one season. It's undeniable. If he can get a little bit stronger, the agility's kind of the shits. But like this is a guy here that's going to probably go late day 3. Probably 5th round, 6th round. Could even go in the 7th round. I'd invest in that. I'd invest in this stock. Late round pick that has just boomer bust potential, but you're going to get him in a range that you feel comfortable with that boomer bust potential. So Isaiah Land's definitely another guy. And the last one is just try to keep collecting these Georgia Bulldogs. Great athletes. Robert Beal, who would also fit into that role. Just sub rusher. Good athlete. Had a better year 2 years ago at Georgia than he did last season. I think he had like 6 or 7 sacks, which if he left on that, maybe his draft stock would be a little bit higher. It's just get lost in that rotation of the freakish depth that Georgia has on the defensive side of the ball. But he showed great speed, pretty good athlete. Could be someone day 3 that I also would consider. But again, out of all the players, maybe Trenton Simpson's thinking outside the box a little bit. But I think someone like me, for my opinion, for the value, like Yasir Abdullah, 4th round, 5th round, somewhere in that range. That would have been my preferable pick for Hassan Reddick depth. So now we're going to look at defensive ends, straight up DNs. These are guys that you would bring in to either, maybe even potentially start. If you got Will Anderson Jr., Philadelphia traded up for Will Anderson Jr., you're doing that with the idea he's going to be your starter, and you're going to have Brandon Graham like sub in and out, which, that's not, is that the worst thing, right? Like, you can preserve Brandon Graham a little bit, get more out of him late in the season. But Will Anderson Jr. would be a player that I absolutely would try to trade up from pick 10 for, especially if he falls a little bit. And if he falls a little bit, it's going to be more so because the quarterbacks are just going early. But like, if he's still there, let's just say on the 4th pick. If Arizona does something different, or Arizona trains back to a team that's getting a quarterback, if he's still there at the 4th pick, I'd consider it. Because I don't think it would cost you like a crazy amount to go from 10 to 4. It's not going to cost you multiple first. It's basically that cut-up point of like, what could we trade up for without having to trade up 2 first-round picks? 4, 5s in the range. And if Will Anderson's still in that range, like there's some people that think Tyree Wilson is going to go ahead of Will Anderson Jr., maybe from a scheme fit, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not even going to talk about Tyree Wilson because he's kind of in that no man's land. If I'm trading up for Philadelphia to get an edge rusher, I'm getting Will Anderson. I'm not trading it for Tyree Wilson. And I don't think Tyree Wilson's still going to be on the board at pick 10, even though he has great traits, great tools. Will Anderson Jr., though, is one of the blue chip players in this year's draft class. And I do think, without a shadow of a doubt, whatever it would cost to trade up for him, he's probably the only guy I think I would for sure trade up for. Probably would do it for Jalen Carter. Probably. But if you just, you said right now, you could trade up for Jalen Carter and it doesn't cost you a first-round pick, would you do it? I'd be like, what's this? Well, did we get a good vibe test on him? Did we come back with any information on the off the field? If you said, C4, we're coming back, you can trade up for Will Anderson, it's not going to cost a first-round pick. Yes. No hesitation. That is a guy right there that would be unreal for the Philadelphia Eagles. If you don't know, Will Anderson, do you know what Will Anderson did last year? And here's the thing right now. People are knocking on him for a bad 2022. He got like double and triple team all season and still had 17 TFLs and 10 sacks. So you remember we talked about Isaiah Land, right? Small school, Florida A&M player, ridiculous production. Here's what Will Anderson did in 2021. 102 tackles. Tackles, right? No, tackles doesn't indicate a good player. 34 and a half tackles for loss, 17 and a half sacks. He is one of the best college players I have ever seen. He is my number one player in this year's draft class. I would trade up for him. That's it. End of story. He is ridiculous. He could do it all. The only real weakness is that he's not an S-tier athlete. And even like these numbers look pretty good, but I think when all said and done, he'd probably have like a high 8 RAS. He wasn't going to be a 9.99 RAS or something ridiculous like that. You know, in a perfect world, if you're making this guy in a lab and he's truly an alien, you might make him a slightly better athlete than what he is. But other than that, man, he's still blue chip. This would be my dream pick for Philadelphia. Until he gets picked by a team that's not Philadelphia, I'm going to, like, my number one scenario in the draft at pick 10 is we trade up to get Will Anderson. So other options here for Philadelphia. I do like Myles Murphy. I do think that, you know, the idea, now that we're looking for pass rushers that can succeed Brandon Graham, I feel a little bit more comfortable getting the developmental guys. Obviously, we've talked about Sean Desai. I'm not going to talk about that for every single player. We feel like we have a staff that can develop players on the defensive side of the ball. And that's exactly what you get with Myles Murphy. 6'4", elite speed, good agility. The only problem with him is you always kind of, like, you're waiting for his breakout year every year. And he's been solid. 3 years starter at Clemson. 37 tackles for loss, 17 and a half sacks, 6 forced fumbles. Good production. But it also feels like ever since he won Freshman All-American, it was just like you assumed, like, it's like, boom, he was going to continue to, his stock was going to continue to shoot up. And it kind of just, like, leveled out. And you're always hoping for that next, like, every year, Myles Murphy was hyped up. It was like, he's going to break out. He's going to break out. He's just kind of been a good player for his college career. So that's definitely, like, maybe a slight concern when it comes to him as far as value. It'd be someone that I would consider trading down from pick 10. I think pick 10 might be a little bit rush of a development. Like, again, I just think you pick a guy 10, you don't want to get a guy that is going to have to be a year away. I don't want to rush Myles Murphy, but if you get him at pick 10, you're going to have this, like, almost thought in your head, like, you got to get him on the field. He's going to have to play. He's got to have to eat into Brandon Graham snaps a little bit. So I don't know if we could trade back in the late teens and say if, like, that's the idea and we're not going for a Bijan Robinson. Something like Myles Murphy, I'd feel pretty comfortable gambling on his athleticism. Another popular name is Lucas Van Ness. And he seems like right now on Eagles Twitter, this is the guy that, like, no one wants at pick 10. I think pick 10's a little rich for a player of his capabilities because much like Myles Murphy, he's going to play behind Brandon Graham. He's a developmental player. High ceiling, man. I think there's absolutely high ceiling there. Great athlete. Definitely fits the build of what Philadelphia looks like for a defensive lineman. His game, honestly, like if I'm projecting his ceiling, I could see a Brandon Graham type. A guy that might always be a little bit better of a run defender than he is a pure pass rusher. A popular comp is Grizzly Bear when you watch him play, but because he really only has one move. He has great athleticism and tries to win with the power move. Things are going to come. He hasn't played a whole lot of football in his time at Iowa, but I think that also he's being a little bit overvalued. I don't see him as a top 10 pick. I don't see him as a top 10 talent in this year's draft class. Well, some people do. I have him more so. Like, this is a guy, like, I'd feel a lot more comfortable getting him at pick 30. It's probably never going to happen. He's going to go a little bit earlier than that, but he very much is not someone that I would be ecstatic if we got at pick 10. He's someone that I'd feel a little bit more better getting in the teens just because of where he is at as a prospect. An underrated player is BJ Oogilari. Now we're talking about players from here on out that are going to be pick 30 going into the second, third round, and so on and so on. BJ Oogilari, I think this is someone here that you would consider at pick 30, or if we trade down at a pick 30 into the early second round, he could be there. I think he's an underrated SEC productive pass rusher, 25 and a half TFL, 60 and a half sacks in 3 years. And I think that while he didn't really test, he didn't get to see 40-yard dash, he got great bend. He's like stylistically a little bit of like Josh Sweat to his game, I would say. Not as long. I think Josh Sweat's obviously like, 6'4", but I do think he has some pretty good bend, and I think that that's kind of like the style. If you like what Josh Sweat brings to the Eagles, I think you get a little bit of that BJ Oogilari, be a nice developmental option. Maybe argument of how high his ceiling could be, what kind of player he could grow into being, but I think sooner than later, he will be a very nice rotational pass rusher in the NFL. I would say pick 30 be maybe a little rich. I'd feel a lot better getting him in the second round than I would in the first round. But he's a little bit underrated right now, I think, when all is said and done. Derek Hall, out of Auburn. Great athlete. Great explosion. 4.57. Productive in the SEC, which is always, obviously I'm a fan of a team that's in the SEC barely last year in Florida. But the last 2 seasons in the SEC, he has 24.5 TFLs, 16 sacks. You test like this. You post those type of numbers. And while you may be a little bit of a one-dimensional speed rusher, this is a guy right now projected to go second, third round. Give me a rotational pass rusher, kind of like where the Dallas Cowboys got Sam Williams last year out of Ole Miss. Kind of get vibes like that from Derek Hall. Kind of get vibes like that from Isaiah Foskey. I think he's pretty He was a guy that I thought, honestly, just kind of seeing every Notre Dame game here. I must have just watched the Notre Dame games that he was not playing particularly well. I thought he was overrated. Looked at it. There's a lot of traits you want to gamble on here. 6'5", elite length, elite speed, great explosion, production off the charts, 12.5 TFLs, 11 sacks, 6 forced fumbles in 2021. Last year, 14 TFLs, 11 sacks. There's not a whole lot that you're missing. You could get stronger. Might not be the best run defender, but good project player. Put him behind Josh Sweat. Let him learn from Josh Sweat's game a little bit. And if you're getting him second round, potentially he could fall to the third round. Dane Brugler has a second, third round grade on him. Third round, I'm all over Isaiah Foskey. I think he's one of the better value picks at edge rusher in this draft. And it's fair to say, everyone wants to say that their team drafts athletes, but it's pretty much proven the last couple of years for the Philadelphia Eagles, they might as well just be using this Raz site. Philly is only drafting athletes for the most part. I'd say 90% of our picks are great athletes, so that's kind of a common theme here. Another underrated guy, it's a former 5-star recruit, which I've said I've kind of just found when I'm writing down guys that I think I'm a little bit sold on that are day 3 picks. I'm finding a lot of former 5-star recruits. That's exactly what KJ Henry is. Had some injury issues, struggled getting on the field at Clemson, but last year finally got on there. 9 TFLs, 3.5 sacks. Tested pretty well. Good length, good elite speed. I just feel like nice rotational player. If we're getting into day 3, definitely someone that I like. We're going to have a little bit of Canadian bias here. Latavius Robinson. This is a little bit of a height, weight, speed. I think he's my sleeper. I already talked about this on Twitter. He is my sleeper edge rusher. And I talked about it on Patreon in this year's draft class. Not enough people are talking about him. Came from Canada, went to Ole Miss last year, first year as a starter, 8 TFLs, 7 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, and a legit 6'6", running a 4.66. Maybe obviously agility not the best, but great length, great bend. I think he's underrated with his hands. Can get off blocks. Relentless. Almost all of his sacks that you would have saw last year at Ole Miss, it was not something that he won right off the get-go. He'd had to recombat with an offensive tackle multiple times and eventually win. Great relentless pass rush. Projected to go in the 6th round. This is my day 3 pass rusher for the Philadelphia Eagles that I want to try to see them land. Latavius Robinson, and that's not just Canadian bias. Wrapping up here, Yaya Diaby is another one out of Louisville, just S-tier athlete. That's honestly why we're kind of just pitching him in here. Between him and Yasir Abdullah, Louisville had some excellent athletes on their defense last season, so he kind of fits the mold. He's going to be a little bit more expensive. It's, you're talking 3rd round-ish range, but 14.5 TFLs, 9 sacks last season. Great athlete. Definitely a guy that'd be intriguing to develop. Another great athlete. Didn't get the test as much as we would have thought. Kind of reminds me of Mozzie Smith from Michigan in terms of the hype that these guys had going to the testing process of the draft. We didn't really get to see a whole lot of it. But Zach Harrison is a big-time athlete. Height, weight, speed, rotational, developmental pass rusher. 3rd, 4th round, somewhere in that range. He'll be a name to watch for sure. And lastly, we have Tuipulotu. We have his brother Marlon on the team, and he's a guy that was really bizarre because USC listed him at almost 300 pounds. So he's all right, he's going to be a 3 technique. And then during this process, he's 266. That is interesting. But he's one of the most productive pass rushers last year in college football in 2022 on a very bad USC. USC had one of the worst defenses in all of college football last year. Every time I watched him play, it was bad. He was a lone bright spot. 22 TFLs, 13.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles last season for the Trojans. And while you might not get ridiculous length at him, he's a little bit shorter. I do feel honestly, you might get a little Brandon Graham, where Brandon Graham starts at the defensive end and kind of comes on the inside as an interior pass rusher. You might get a little bit of that out of Tuipulotu's game. So I think you're getting into the 3rd round, 4th round, and you're looking for someone stylistically that might line up with Brandon Graham. I think Tuipulotu is the best fit in that range. So there you go, fellas. Those are some edge rushers that the Philadelphia Eagles should consider. A little bit of a longer video because we kind of got to talk about two different styles of edge rushers that we currently have on our defense. And it's obvious how Richmond likes to build through the trenches. So we likely will be drafting an edge rusher. Let's hope it's not any of the guys I didn't talk about because I'm not big fans of them, like a Keon White or... who else do I not like? Keon White, not the biggest fan. And honestly, half these guys, do we pick them at pick 10? Like, I don't want to overdraft any player, especially at that edge rusher spot, because likely they're going to just be a rotational piece on the team. But what edge rusher do you want to see Philadelphia draft? Let me know in the comment section below. That'll do it for me today, guys. Hopefully tomorrow, if not Tuesday, we'll be back talking about some linebackers, because looking at that linebacking room, we definitely are going to need some help alongside Nakobe Dean. Should be a good one. I'll see you then. But till then, it's your boy C4 saying peace out. Love ya. Like, subscribe, all that cheesy YouTube stuff, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.